Hello and welcome to this video on the bonsai terms that you either need to know or that might confuse you. If you're new to bonsai, or perhaps you just started watching random videos on YouTube and found your way to bonsai, you will hear terms that might be confusing or seemingly out of place. Hopefully this video will do one of two things: clarify those terms or confuse you more. We very much hope for the former, but the latter is entirely possible. We can start with two related terms that come up every now and then: penjing and bonsai. Bonsai is the Japanese term used for growing miniaturized trees in containers. It's supposed to emphasize harmony and natural aesthetics. By contrast, penjing is arguably the precursor, and it's the Chinese counterpart. It's more elaborate, or perhaps it'd be better to say it's a more elaborate landscape or diorama. It includes more rocks and often has figures involved. Because of this, there are far fewer rules, and they are certainly less strict. Because of this, if you were to contrast the two, bonsai is typically more structured to conform with a given style and focuses on just the tree. And next you have things like jin and shari. Jin refers to a dead branch, a snag, or something similar that's often bleached or weathered. It's supposed to mimic natural aging of a broken branch or similar. Think of a broken branch on a tree, such as those that are broken from weather, lightning strikes, and so on, that have been left out and therefore eventually bleached from light. This is done artificially, but it is the same idea. Shari is a dead wood on the trunk where bark has been stripped to create a rather dramatic effect. Think, for example, if a branch has broken off a tree and torn out a large section of the trunk as it's broken off. This would be a combination of either shari and jin, or sometimes just the shari. The confusing element is that the distinction here may not always be clear, as sometimes the two sort of blend together. And next we have the nebari and the roots themselves. The nebari is where the trunk and the roots mesh together. It should be a nice, gentlish slope, where the trunk tapers out to a more broad base, and from this, the roots begin radiating away. It should be somewhat flared. Typically speaking, nebari is rather prized in bonsai, and it's considered, let's say, necessary for a balance with the bonsai. Root flare is typically also used in English, although technically speaking it's slightly different. A yamadori is a term used for trees that are collected from the wild. Depending on what they are, where you are, and everything else, they can be valued for their, say, natural nature, aged appearance, and similar. A nursery stock, by contrast, are trees obviously grown in a nursery. A yamadori doesn't necessarily mean, let's say, absolutely wild. They can be trees that were grown, say, in the garden and collected from there. For example, somebody is landscaping. A chop is a cut, and always a rather drastic cut, either to the trunk or to a substantial branch that forms a major element of the bonsai itself. This is done to, say, redirect growth, create taper, and is very distinct from regular pruning, which is generally done for shape and health of the bonsai. Backbudding is a term that should be obvious from the name, but not always so. It's when you get new buds growing on older wood, typically wood that's hardened off and is essentially older and established. So, for example, some species it may be several years old, and sometimes even older again, depending on the age of the bonsai. The backbudding is important as it ensures that branches grow behind where they are at the very, let's say, front of the branch, so you don't end up with just a hollow shell of a bonsai. You get internal branching and internal foliage as well. Bud pinching is related to this in that you are literally pinching out the new growth on the very edge of the tree, that is at the end of the branch. This not only controls shape, but also encourages more vigorous growth further back or in other parts of the tree. Akadama is a, let's say, soil solution, or soil ingredient is a better word for it. It's clay-based and is very similar to, say, volcanic rock and similar. What it's for is to provide a certain amount of moisture retention to aerate the soil, and also just simply to make it drain more freely. You also have another two ingredients called kanama and kiryu. kanama is a similar product, except it's more acidic and suited towards azaleas, whereas we have kiryu, which is more gritty and drains better, which is intended more for pines and junipers. The three are not necessarily interchangeable, especially the kanama, where it's specifically acidic, but to an extent they are, depending on the species. Deciduous bonsai are, well, the same as regular deciduous trees. They all lose their leaves come autumn. Evergreens keep their leaves all year round, so for example pine trees. Defoliation is related to this. Defoliation is effectively recreating what happens in autumn by removing all of the leaves on the tree. They're typically for deciduous trees, and what this does is encourage those branches to grow back again, and when they grow back, as we'll touch shortly as ramification, you get smaller leaves and more leaves. Leaf pruning also can be used to, let's say, alter the shape and or health of the tree itself. Ramification, as we mentioned, is a fine, let's say, intricate structure of branches that grow as the branch divides into two. By cutting it back each time, the branch is reduced to just two, or essentially a fork, and that fork can then multiply, and because you have more of these in one area, you get a much denser canopy. A taper is something we mentioned earlier when we were talking about nebari, and it's the going from a very wide base, typically, to a very narrow top. This is specifically talking about the trunk though. The bonsai itself may not necessarily follow this exactly, but the general trend is there. A reverse taper is when you have a thickening of the trunk at a point higher up above the soil, so you don't have the nebari being the widest point of the tree. Rather, instead, somewhere further up the tree is substantially thicker. Then we have uros, which are a change made to the trunk typically. They're a hollow made. This is done either by nature or sometimes, let's say, nature has started the process and then it's enhanced artificially. What you're trying to do either way is mimic aging and weathering of the trunk itself. For example, random damage done to the tree, possibly damage from rot, or similar, but you want to make sure to treat it in such a way that if it is caused by rot or similar, you remove that and then not necessarily seal it, but treat it in a way, for example with lime sulfur, that prevents it from rotting again. Savamiki refers to a trunk that has been split, or a hollowed trunk, which creates a rather dramatic effect and typically is artificially weathered. Shari miki, or sometimes just called a shari, is when you just strip the bark along the trunk, which exposes the dead wood without splitting. So the two are related, but not necessarily the same. Sekijoju is when you have roots growing over a rock and in the soil below. This is intended to emphasize the roots. By contrast, you have Ishizuki, which features a tree which is clinging to a rock, and this often has very minimal soil, and the soil that is there is nearly always in a crevice. This mimics more cliffside growth rather than over rock growth. A wound sealer is another term that is used, and it's often confused with cutting paste, although the two are very closely related. A wound sealer is a general term for products that protect cuts from infection or drying out. Cut paste is specifically a type of sealer, often made from clay but not always, which is supposed to promote healing and prevent dieback. As said, the two terms are often used interchangeably, but they are distinct. We then have guy wires, which are meant to anchor branches to the pot, and it allows the trunk to be pulled into position. By contrast, branch weights, which will hang from branches rather obviously, are intended to gently bend and pull on the branch, nearly always downward, or at least using gravity, and this is more for subtle adjustments rather than major changes, although over the long term, a subtle change will add up very quickly. We then have rsuchi, which really just means Japanese bonsai soil specifically, and it's nearly always a mix of things like adama, pumice, lava rock, your organics, and so on. Substrate is just a broader term, which is used for any growing medium, but it's not always bonsai specific, but we would argue it's more convenient for most applications, as you're not always using, say, bonsai soil for many things. For example, you have accent plants, if you have moss you're trying to grow, there are other things that may not exactly be bonsai soil. We then have, when you're looking at your bonsai, we have the front. The front is the primary viewing angle of the bonsai from the viewer's point of view, rather obviously, but if you were, for example, showcasing it at an exhibition, what it's meant to do is show the best trunk line, the nebari, and any branch arrangement for a given style. The exact angle chosen may, let's say, shift somewhat for different displays, but it's nearly always defined by the aesthetic of the style and what is decided as the front's aesthetic choice. We then have a deadwood. Now, deadwood can cover jin and shari, as I've already mentioned, but not always. There is a general rule that it covers those two, and it's intentionally, let's say, added or modified from living bonsai to mimic natural aging. A driftwood style refers to bonsai with much more extensive deadwood, and what it does is, rather obviously, resemble weathered wood that's washed ashore, but the tree is still alive. The driftwood style is rather like beauty pageant participants. They look alive on the outside, but they're dead inside, except in this case, they look dead on the outside, but they're alive on the inside as a bonsai. We mentioned these before, but we have accent plants or companion plants. The latter is often called kusamono. These are small potted plants, for example grasses, flowers, ferns, and so on. They're displayed alongside a bonsai to enhance the aesthetic or suggest, say, a season. So they're not just purely table decoration. They are meant to do something, and not always successfully, but they are meant to. Then we have the, let's say, cascades. First of all, kengai. This is a trunk that cascades well below the pot's base. This is typically just called a cascade in English. It's meant to mimic a cliffside tree. Han kegai, otherwise known as a semi-cascade, extends downwards, but they tend to not go below the pot's rim, or in some cases the pot's base, but generally the rim is what's chosen. It's a less extreme form. For example, if you were to compare the two, a kengai is a tree growing out from a cliff entirely, whereas han kegai, or a semi-cascade, is a tree that's growing, say for example, down a cliff face, where it still remains close to the surface, but it doesn't ever actually leave the surface. These are a range of terms that sometimes need to be known and differentiated when understanding bonsai. In some other cases, they're just useful. Others again are, let's say, more rare or used in very specific contexts. But hopefully it's explained some of what you're going to encounter if, for example, you go to an exhibition, if you start watching random videos or similar. You'll have some idea about what's going on. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.